All right, here I am on a Saturday evening with the incredible Father Deacon Dragani. We're going to be talking about a topic that people here know very well that I really, really love digging into. I've probably debated about purgatory more than anything else. Purgatory and Mariology have had many debates. I've written a lot about purgatory. I love talking about it. But Father Deacon Dragani, one thing that really does come up a lot, I want to tell you before we begin, is I'll have people leave a comment and they'll say, well, look, within Eastern Christianity, whether Orthodoxy or Catholicism, we are not allowed to believe in purgatory. We don't believe in purgatory. Or people that really will reach out and say, William, what do we believe in regards to this? I am an Eastern Catholic. I'm a Byzantine. I'm a Melkite. So in order to really kind of help us with that, Father Deacon is going to really be here to do an incredible job. You always do an incredible job with everything, Father. But I want to, before we even begin, ask you, how have you been, Father Deacon?
I've been wonderful. Life has been good. Many blessings.
Incredible. You have been quite active, I believe.
A lot going on, yeah, both on YouTube, but also in life.
Awesome, very, very good. And I noticed you've done some shows with my brother Michael over there recently. Yes. Theology. Great material there. People really enjoy having you on. And we've done a show here before. People loved it when you came on. So I know we will have a lot of fun talking about this. So let me dive in right away. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this first. And for the audience that are wondering, what I love about Father Deacon, we don't rehearse anything. We come right in. We're going to have a great conversation. I've got my coffee ready. Anything that comes to my mind, I'm going to toss it his way. So let me ask you right away, off the top of your head, before we even dive in, when it comes to purgatory, is there a different definition of purgatory in Eastern Catholicism?
No. But here's the thing. In Eastern Christianity in general, the term itself is typically avoided.
Right.
So the word is not used, but the core belief is pretty much the same between East and West, the core belief. The problem is many people in the East dramatically misunderstand the Catholic understanding of purgatory, and they think the Catholics believe things they don't actually believe about it.
Yeah. And I have noticed that very often, Father, and I've got to be very clear. To be fair to my not only Eastern Catholic brothers and sisters, Eastern Orthodox as well, to be fair to them, when they've come to me and dialogued with me, a lot of the times they do present things that I even hear at Catholic churches from the pulpit, unfortunately, which a lot of the time do seem to be incorrect when it comes to Catholic theology. And I can totally understand the kind of desire to maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is it more of an avoiding utilizing certain terminologies, or is it really kind of just trying to retain one's tradition, but it's still lining up? What are your thoughts on that?
I think from an Eastern perspective, it's about retaining one's tradition.
Yeah.
In Eastern Christianity, it's very important as a principle to try and hold on to what was passed on by the fathers. Mm-hmm. And anything that's seen as kind of altering that or going too far astray from the fathers is looked upon with suspicion.
Let me ask you this, Father Deacon, when it comes to purgatory and looking at it with Eastern lenses, if you will, would it be okay if I utilized Latin language like punishment in the afterlife, utilizing terminology that would be very Augustinian, if you will? Is the kind of language utilized by Augustine, would that be okay when perhaps talking to an Eastern Catholic?
Yes. I think the problem, though, I'll get to the heart of the matter. Mm-hmm. So here's the issue. There's a lot of writing among the fathers, both East and West, about the value of praying for the dead, mm-hmm. and about a purification that takes place after death. And really, the Eastern and Western traditions are pretty unanimous that there's a merit to praying for the dead, something you want to do, and that there's some sort of purification that takes place. Mm-hmm. Now, here's where it gets unfortunately challenging. So when you begin to talk about purgatory as being a place,
Yeah.
Like a third place between heaven and hell, or a created place, that's highly problematic from an Eastern perspective. And so is the idea of there being literal fire in
Yeah.
purgatory.
Hmm.
And really, those two things are the main objections. Now, here's the funny part. The Catholic Church does not teach that purgatory is a place.
Yeah.
And the Catholic Church does not teach that there's literal fire in purgatory. Those two things are not Catholic teaching at all. There may have been speculation by, Catholic writers and theologians over many centuries about these things. But if you really get to the nitty-gritty of it, if you look, for example, at what you find in the Council of Lyons, the Council of Florence, if you look at what's in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, or the writings of, say, Pope John Paul II or Pope Benedict XVI, it becomes very clear that there really are only two key things that make up the core of the Catholic teaching of purgatory. And it's this. Number one, praying for the dead is helpful. It helps the souls that are dead. And number two, there is a purification that takes place after death, in a sense that between the time we die and we're with God in heaven, something has to change in us. And again, that goes to the idea that in Christianity, we are truly transformed by God. It's not just that we're declared righteous, but we're left being a dunghill covered in snow, to use that language, but God actually changes us and transforms us. So something has to happen between the time we die and the time we're in the presence of God to bring about that transformation. Call it purgatory, call it whatever, but there has to be a change that takes place. So, if you look at the catechism, if you look at those councils that I mentioned, if you look at those popes that I mentioned, the two main things that come out is there's some sort of purification, some sort of change. It's really a state of being more so than a place. And secondly, that we pray for the dead. That's it. Those two things are the core of Catholic teaching. Anything else is a speculation or useful theory. So if you look at the Orthodox objections, especially to purgatory, they're almost always objecting to those two things, which really Catholics do not believe.
Yeah, I have noticed that very frequently, Father. You're correct about that. Now, I want to get to talking a little bit about the fire and then about it being a location. But before I get there, would it be okay if, when dialoguing with an Eastern brother or sister, if we also noted that perhaps there's a possibility of there being pain in that purification? Would that be okay? Or would perhaps the Eastern Church kind of object to that? And the reason I ask that is because when I look at passages like 1 Corinthians 3, which, by the way, were overwhelmingly interpreted in the purgatorial sense by the Eastern Fathers as well. And I look at the language there. To me, it really does seem like there, of course, is purification going on. But I believe you can extrapolate a kind of suffering, a kind of pain being undergone by the soul in the afterlife. Would that be okay to utilize that particular kind of language as well?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you definitely find that in many of the fathers talking about the state after death. Oftentimes purification involves some level of pain, right?
Yeah.
But that being said, I need to clarify something. There is no monolithic Eastern view on this.
Right.
And that's where things get tricky, right? When we talk about the Catholic perspective or the Roman Catholic perspective, it's pretty well laid out. There's a whole developed tradition, a lot of speculation, but it's pretty well developed. In Eastern Christianity, it's a big question mark. Eastern Christianity believes in those same two things that are the essential Catholic beliefs, that there's a state of purification and that prayer is efficacious. But anything beyond that is complete speculation. So you'll find some Eastern Christians who will have no trouble agreeing with the idea that there's pain there. And there are others who would reject that simply because some Roman Catholic author asserted it.
Yeah.
So there's really no agreement. Now, as an Eastern Catholic, I will say this. One thing that distinguishes Eastern Catholicism from our separated Eastern Christian brethren is that as Eastern Catholics, we believe that what Roman Catholics believe is at the very least not heretical.
Yeah.
We may not always express things the same way. We may see things differently, but we also believe that these are mysteries of faith that can be looked at validly from different angles. These different angles complement each other. But because we're in communion with the Western Roman Catholic Church, because we believe what the Catholic Church teaches, we don't consider Catholic beliefs to be heretical. We consider them to be true, but we may look at things differently through our own theological lenses. But again, they complement each other. They don't contradict. Some Orthodox Christians, unfortunately, have come to define themselves against Catholicism. And that's where you have a big problem today. And I've got a story to illustrate this, which it's very telling. So 1 second here.
No problem at all. Yeah, definitely.
So a while back, I was visiting an online, message board for Eastern Christians. And the people who primarily dominate this message boards are converts to Eastern Orthodoxy. Probably 90% former Protestant, maybe some former Catholics who are now Orthodox. And they tend to be, more Orthodox than the Patriarch of Constantinople, if you know what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
And, the zeal of converts, and you can't blame them for that. But somebody got on there who was very deeply troubled, and troubled by something that he had just read. He was very, very upset and worried. So, he had been Protestant, he had become Orthodox, and he kind of brought his anti-Catholicism with him. And many of the folks on that particular site, they are very anti-Catholic, and for them, Orthodoxy equals not Catholic. So he came across some writings by Saint Mark of Ephesus. Saint Mark of Ephesus is an Eastern Orthodox saint, one of the pillars of Orthodoxy. He's often credited with, torpedoing the reunion of Florence, although that really isn't accurate in my opinion.
Right.
But he came across some of his writings. We're curious about them because, the Orthodox Church holds this fellow in extremely high esteem. He began reading the writings of St. Mark of Ephesus, and this threw him into a tailspin. And you can probably guess why. Because when you actually sit down and read the writings of St. Mark of Ephesus, he's more Catholic than most Catholics are today. The things he asserts are things that a lot of the modern Orthodox apologists vehemently reject. Really, if you dive in, it's remarkable. He makes a pretty strong case for a papal primacy even. He didn't like the idea of the Pope being beyond reproach in case there was a heretical Pope, but in the core teachings on the Catholic understanding of the Bishop of Rome, a lot of them you can find in his writings. Well, this fellow on this forum, he was reading St. Mark of Ephesus's writings on purgatory. And he was getting all ready to hear a good rejection of the Western belief, And he got on there extremely confused and upset because St. Mark of Ephesus immediately says, we reject the notion of purgatory because we don't believe in a literal fire, right? There's no literal fire, and it's not a temporal place created by God. There's no third place between heaven and hell, and there's no literal fire. And then he goes on to explain why they believe that there's this purification that must take place after death, and how praying for people in that state helps them. And he lays out essentially the Catholic belief in purgatory. So this fellow was really disturbed because he said, I was always told that as Orthodox Christians, we reject purgatory, but here I'm reading St. Mark of Ephesus explaining purgatory and essentially laying out a solid case for it, while at the same time condemning those who believe in a literal fire. This little story kind of illustrates half the problem, which is people are so concerned with defining themselves against something else that they oftentimes don't look at the fullness of their own tradition. And the fullness of their own tradition within Eastern Orthodoxy is this. Their understanding of what takes place after death is essentially the same as what Catholics believe. They may not use the word purgatory, but it's at the core the same beliefs. Years ago, I had a situation where I was sharing an office with somebody. This is back when I was a grad student, and I shared an office with several people, actually. But there's one fellow I was in this office with a lot who was an Orthodox priest. He was with the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. Wonderful man. Brilliant, very holy. Truly holy, kind, compassionate priest. He was much more interested in being a disciple of Christ than he was arguing with people, right? I admire that.
Oh, yeah.
He and I had a long discussion about purgatory one time, and he said to me, he said, listen, he said, we believe the same thing.
Yeah.
We believe the same thing on this, and anyone who says otherwise is just looking to nitpick. But at the core, we have the same faith. And I remember during that period, I was working with EWTN answering questions. I'd go on EWTN's website and add like a forum on there where to answer people's questions about Eastern Catholicism. I was one of their online experts. And somebody was asking me about the Eastern Christian understanding of purgatory. And I wanted to get it right. So I read out this whole thing and I kind of ran it past this Orthodox priest. And he's like, yeah, that's it. That's exactly what we believe. This is accurate. And I posted it on there. And then like a few weeks later, on some Orthodox forum, they cut and pasted my answer, put it on there, and then raked me over the coals for misrepresenting Eastern Christianity. The truth of the matter is the belief system when it comes to this is really the same. Just the terminology is different. That's pretty much it.
Father Deacon, I don't mean to be polemical in any way, but I want to be very clear. The majority of the people that do the critiquing, I doubt they've ever even read Mark of Ephesus. I've rarely encountered, and I have a lot of great moderators here that are Eastern Orthodox. People don't realize I've got a lot of my moderators are Orthodox. I probably don't know more than maybe one or two that have read Mark of Ephesus. So it is not I am not attacking them. My only emphasis is read your great patriarchal figures and realize we have much more in common. There should be more light and really the love of Christ and charity than a lot of the times than we are able to see. Now, what I put there on the image right there is the language of Mark of Ephesus, homily 1 on purgatory.
Yes.
You brought up an incredible point, Father Deacon, because when I was preparing for a debate in purgatory, it was a couple of years back, I remember, I pulled up the homily, and I remember, Father Deacon, your words are echoing in my head. 4.5 years ago, I said, all right, anti-Catholic, totally against purgatory, Mark of Ephesus. I pulled it up. What on earth? There is every affirmation we read there. We can affirm it as a Catholic. Nowhere has the church ever formally defined that the fire is a literal fire. But then for people today, Father Deacon, you hear it very often. Oh, well, we don't believe in that kind of post-mortem punishment. It is compatible. Mark tells you, for some are cleansed by fear, while others are devoured by the gnawing of conscience. And then he tells you, with more torment than any fire, others are cleansed only the very terror before the divine glory. Now, I'm very glad that you did bring up Mark of Ephesus, Father Deacon, because even Mark of Ephesus, even his Mariology is very different from a lot of modern day Orthodox. Now, I want to be very clear, not all of them. But today we're living in a time where I want to tell my Eastern brothers and sisters, you don't have to believe that you have to follow every little thing that you read online that other people tell you, you have to follow that. Well, look, the Mariology of Mark of Ephesus is very different than what we've seen it turn into today. And I don't want to go off on a completely different topic, but I think you get where I'm going at, that there has been a bit of an evolution and a moving away from, I think of St. Gregory Palamas as well. His Mariology quite different than the Mariology of online individuals you might find in 2022. I wonder, what are your thoughts on that and your advice? How do we maybe dialogue with our Eastern brothers and sisters and let them know, look, believing in these things perhaps is not uniquely Catholic. You're allowed to believe them as well, and you shouldn't be afraid to affirm them.
An interesting exercise. I've never done this, but I've thought about it. Is to go onto these websites with these extremely zealous ultra-Orthodox people, and without naming your source, start quoting Mark of Ephesus and put out some of the things he believed. and they would immediately, my guess is they would immediately just start ripping it to shreds and saying how wrong it is, how heretical it is, not realizing that they're condemning one of the pillars of orthodoxy. Because really, it is that the difference is that stark. Again, I'm not an expert on Mark of Ephesus, but I've read some of his writings. You know, little things here. I've read that homily, for example, on Purgatory that you quoted from. I've read some of the other stuff, and everything I've read is way more, for lack of a better word, Catholic than what you'd find on your typical Orthodox apologist website.
Yeah.
Way more, way more. And I think they'd probably condemn a lot of what he's saying if they didn't know it was coming from him.
Yeah, one other thing that I think of, Father Deacon, we've done a show. I recommend people go check it out. We have done a show where we talk about Holy Mary. I would recommend people try doing this. Read to them what Mark had to what he talked about when it comes to Holy Mary, and find out if they're able to affirm that. And if they're unable to affirm it, then reveal to them who you're reading about. They'll be shocked at what Mark of Ephesus. I mean, I've done shows where you can literally line up the theology of Mark of Ephesus with that of Blessed Duns Scotus. You'd be hard pressed to find differences in what they say about Holy Mary. I think that really does tell you a lot.
Big
really
time.
Now, you brought up, these are two really, really good points. I wrote them down so I wouldn't forget. Now, when it comes to the fire, you read about the fire in Augustine, in Jerome, in multiple other fathers. But the one thing that I know that there are certain fathers that do believe the fire to have been literal, but the church never defined it as being literal. One father I think of, one father that comes to mind would Hippolytus of Rome. There are other ones. So I want to pick your brain here, Father Deacon. If the fire was never a dogmatically defined literal fire, why the emphasis against it once we get to Florence? Do you believe that perhaps the theologians, the Latin theologians, the Latin individuals leading up to that, do you think that perhaps maybe they were emphasizing the fire? What do you think happened there? Because I'm with you totally. The church never defined the fire was a literal fire. So really, why the need to just combat that idea?
Because there were people pushing it.
Okay.
There were. And this, interestingly enough, was a pretty recent development around the time of, both Lyon and Florence. That only within a century or two before then did this even begin, where there were some people in the West who were pushing the idea that it was a literal fire, and they wanted to dogmatize it. And some of those people were present, at these councils.
Yeah.
But interestingly enough, the councils, in both occasions, did not define the fire as being literal. It did not go there. It did not go there. And one could argue that's the work of the Holy Spirit, because it sure left a door open that I think is an opening that could lead to positive things in the future, along with other things, of course. So what I would say is that there were people who are being very literal about the fire, because fire clearly is an image you find in Scripture. It's an image you find in the Fathers, but it wasn't meant to be taken literally. But there were people who were. And in the same way, you find people on the Eastern side who take analogies and go too far with them in a literal way. For example, in Eastern Christian writers, many of the Eastern Fathers, for example, talk about something that could be described as toll houses, right? That when a person dies, they go through these stages, and there are different lists of the toll houses. There's no set list. There are different numbers. But the idea is you face a bunch of temptations. In many ways, it kind of mirrors the ladder of divine ascent. John Cassian talks about this kind of thing. There's stuff in Chrysostom about it. But again, they weren't speaking literally. It was an image. It was an image that was helpful. It was an analogy. But then you find people in the East who take that image and go too far and make it a literal thing. And that's a problem you find in the East. So in the West, there's a tendency to make the whole image of fire literal. In the East, there's a tendency to make the toll houses literal. But really, those are both analogies you find in the Fathers that I don't think were ever intended to be taken literally.
Yeah, I'm totally with you there. Now, I'm reminded of the kind of language utilized by Hippolytus as well when he's talking about, kind of like a location where people are purified of their sins, talking about it as being kind of like an underworld. That never really got off the ground. But when it comes to toll houses, Father Deacon, let me pick your brain here. Is that a kind of tradition that ever got off the ground within the patristic era, or was it kind of little bits and pieces there found in various traditions, but it never really kind of got off the ground? Because I'll be very clear, Father Deacon, I have very near and dear friends of mine that will emphasize. They'll say, look, we know it is not dogmatic, but we believe it to have been very prevalent in the early church, and we believe it. So two points, two questions. Can a Catholic believe in toll houses? And the other one, did it ever really get off the ground to being a widespread or wide-held belief?
I'd say it was pretty pervasive in the East. It was,
Okay.
but not literally.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean by that is I don't believe there was ever a literal belief throughout most of the East. But in a lot of the fathers, you find stories that reflect this. I believe in the biography of St. Anthony of Egypt, there's a story where he has a vision of somebody, a soul going to heaven and kind of being swatted down by a demon because it didn't pass a certain test. Again, there are things in Chrysostom and other Eastern fathers that talk about this. But again, it's imagery. It's not a literal truth. And I don't believe the majority of them took it literally. I don't think they did. Some may have, but I don't think most did. I think it was always seen as a helpful image. So it was pretty pervasive in the East, but not in a literal sense.
Would a Catholic would it be okay to hold to it, or would that run contrary to any of the dogmas that we're bound to?
I think for a Catholic to hold to it literally would be problematic.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, I think for most Orthodox to hold to it literally would be problematic. It
I
would
agree.
be.
Yeah.
And there actually are, a lot of Orthodox bishops who condemn it.
Mm-hmm.
There have been, Orthodox, local synods in various places that have condemned it, again, as a literal belief. And this really, in the I want to say 50s and 60s and 70s, there was a famous Orthodox theologian who I'm a fan of, Father Seraphim Rose.
Mm-hmm.
Wrote a lot of great stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And personally, I get a lot out of reading him. I find him very spiritually edifying, but he wasn't right about everything. And he kind of ran with this whole toll house thing, and I think he took it literally, or at least he promoted it in such a way that people thought he took it literally. And this created a lot of backlash within Orthodoxy. Some people kind of latched onto it, but others, I would say, rejected it and said it was just an analogy that went too far. But here's the thing about this. Some modern Orthodox individuals, very often converts to Orthodoxy from other religions, have embraced the toll houses as being literal, in large part because it's not purgatory.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where they're looking for an alternative to what Catholics believe, and something that's very foreign and very exotic, very non-Western. It's easy to latch onto that and say, this is what we believe.
Yeah.
But the reality is, it's much more complicated and nuanced than that. There's another irony in all of this as well.
Anything to run contra to Catholicism, I agree. Some of them are like that.
Yeah. Again, I have many Orthodox friends who are wonderful people who want unity, who want to find common ground, and God bless them. They're probably the silent majority in Orthodoxy. Yeah. But I say silent majority because you don't hear as much from them as you do from the folks who thrive on division. They tend to be the loudest voices these days, more so than in the past. The loudest voices on the internet are the ones who want to emphasize our differences and push for division.
Yeah, I've heard of every kind of division, Father Deacon, to the point where it becomes almost laughable. And I remember when I bring that up, I'm talking about the internet warriors, those that are tougher than anyone who walks on planet Earth. But I find that the internet warriors are usually not as well informed as the other individuals who are usually very intelligent, intellectual, fantastic academically, and they're much kinder, and they recognize, hey, we have a lot more in common than we do different.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this leads to the irony. This is a big irony. I'll lay this out for you. So today in orthodoxy, especially among a lot of the converts, I've encountered this repeatedly. People arguing that the Orthodox position is universalism, that hell will be empty, that everyone will be saved. And that's become a very popular trend in Orthodoxy today. Now, you know and I know that that was never the universal position in Eastern Christianity. There were certain fathers who argued this, like Saint Gregory of Nyssa, a few others, but they were always the minority voice, and it was never accepted. As a matter of fact, that viewpoint was explicitly rejected with the condemnation of Origen. So here's where it gets very intriguing. At the Council of Florence, they heard the Eastern bishops who came, the Orthodox bishops who showed up, were hearing Westerners talk about this place of fire and how you could pray people out of this place of fire. And in their minds, they thought, in some cases at least, some of them thought that the Catholics were talking about praying people out of hell. They thought the Catholics were talking about basically rescuing people from the pits of hell, freeing them through prayer. And the Orthodox bishops at Florence found this very troubling because in their minds, it was a resurgence of Origenism. They saw this idea of praying people out of hell as being an affirmation of what the Orthodox Church had condemned in Origen. So that was one of the reasons why they were so adamantly opposed to this idea of fire and this talk of punishment, for that reason. In other words, they rejected purgatory as being presented by the Western delegates because they saw it as reflecting universalism. Now, today, we have all these Orthodox apologists arguing that universalism is the Orthodox position, not purgatory, but universalism. But really, the rejection of purgatory came from a fear of universalism.
Major irony there. You're totally right there. You bring up a really good point there. Now, I want to highlight a very good question coming from an audience member, and his name is Ryan. Great question. Says, does Father Deacon have any examples in the East of stories like St. Padre Pio, among many others, of interacting with the souls in purgatory and perhaps even freeing them? Are there any?
Lots.
There are. Wow.
Again, they wouldn't use the word purgatory, right? But there are many stories like this all throughout the Eastern tradition. For some recent examples, a favorite Orthodox saint of mine is Saint Paisius, of Mount Athos. Amazing saint. In many ways, he was like the Orthodox counterpart of Padre Pio. Very holy man, a lot of supernatural manifestations. But if you read through his biography, there's story after story of essentially the souls of the dead appearing to him and asking for prayer, and he'll pray for them, and they're liberated. That happened multiple times in his life and in his ministry. And there are other stories like that in other Eastern saints as well. Again, they wouldn't call it purgatory, right? But they're talking about the souls of the dead who are somehow held back from eternal life or held back from heaven, begging for help and mercy, and they pray, and eventually they're able to liberate them.
Wow, incredible. That is and by the way, there are incredible writings that you can read. I don't know if there's a book available on Paisios' writings. I know you can find a few online. Would there be a book you could perhaps recommend on of his, Father Deacon?
Of his specifically, let me think. He wrote a number of books himself.
Okay.
He wrote some, I forget the name of it, but there was one he wrote on the different saints of Mount Athos.
Can you find them maybe in Amazon or anywhere? Are they available?
Oh, yes. If you look up his name on Amazon, you'll see a bunch of books that he wrote, as well as books about him. A great place to begin, actually, is the biography of him. St. Paisius of Athos, I believe is the name of it. But it's a very good book. It's really, spiritually edifying. Some great stories in it. There's nothing in it explicitly anti-Catholic in any way. There are a couple of places where you see the ignorance of Catholicism. I mean, they misunderstood Catholicism, but there's nothing in it that's explicitly anti-Catholic in any way.
Now, you bring up a really good point there, Father Deacon. the kind of perhaps not understanding an aspect of Catholicism. Earlier, you talked about the idea of purgatory being a location, a place. Now, I've got to be very as charitable as I can be. A lot of the times when I'm traveling from parish to parish, Father Deacon, and giving a talk on the topic of purgatory, I have had people wait for me after the talk to chastise me and tell me, William, what do you mean we don't have to believe purgatory is a place? That is taught, that is official Catholic dogma. You hear very often, Father Deacon, why is this particular misunderstanding arisen? Because the church has never defined whether purgatory is a place or not, ever. Let me then ask you, is this a problem that you've encountered as well among Catholics? Perhaps maybe confined to the Latin Catholics mainly? Or
yes, absolutely it is. And there's this perception of purgatory being a place, and that's a very common misconception. All I can figure is there was some sort of piety that was pretty widespread that spoke of it as such, right? A place that you can measure in literal years. We've all seen prayer cards. You do this novena, you get 500 years out of purgatory or whatever. I think we understand that that's just symbolic language, talking about, punishment being lessened. I think time as we understand it doesn't work after death. We can't talk about literal years after death because time is a construct that doesn't mean anything then. Everything changes. But I think people are used to this piety of, do this, get this many years out of purgatory. It's a place of fire and torment. I think that's a popular piety that spread, but it was never, ever actual Catholic teaching. But again, this is what caused a lot of the misconceptions. Remember a while back, I was reading through a very influential book in the history of Orthodoxy, the Catechism of Peter Mogila. I'm not sure the pronunciation. Is that it Mogila?
Mogila, I forget, but I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
But his catechism was extremely influential in Orthodoxy for a long time. It was written in the 17th century. It was one of the main books in the Slavic tradition that people would use to pass on the faith. It was kind of like the Orthodox equivalent of the Baltimore Catechism. Right. And in it, he has a whole section on death in the afterlife. And if you read through it, it lays out exactly what Catholics believe. But then it has to have the customary condemnation of purgatory. And it does that by saying, however, we do not believe that there is a literal fire like the Westerners do. And he even goes so far as to say, we do not believe that people are tortured with prongs. Yeah. He specifically mentions that we do not believe that people are tortured with prongs, because apparently that was one of the common beliefs that people had, and at least in his mind, Catholic purgatory is this place of fire and torment where you sit around for years being tortured with prongs. Ouch. Yeah. But then he completely lays out the Orthodox position, which happens to be exactly like the actual Catholic position.
Father Deacon, when I entered the church, I was Reformed Protestant for many years. I remember falling in love with the Mass. I still am today. Beautiful, incredibly beautiful. But I remember one thing that perhaps bothered me at first was encountering, you brought it up right now, encountering one of those little pious cards where you turn it over and it'll tell you, repeat the prayer on whatever day, perhaps Saturday. And on that day, if you repeat this prayer a given number of times, it will lessen the years of suffering for said loved ones that are in purgatory. Now, I've converted a while back already. Today, I encounter them and I recognize them as, pious beliefs that people have that mean well. They don't mean any harm. They mean very well. But entering the church back then, it bothered me. I'd look at it and say, you know what? It bothers me. Today, you encounter them quite often, but I think people at times, they have they have a problem distinguishing between the fact that these are little pious beliefs and are printed by people probably at their homes. They're not like the Vatican is printing them, shipping them out, and telling them, everybody, give them out. Let me ask you this. Is there anything problematic about those little cards? Because let me tell you my perspective first, Father Deacon. Number one, on the one hand, what does bother me in times is, you know what, people are really kind of pigeonholing the idea of there must be this aspect of time in the afterlife. But then I look at the fact that the prayer cards are calling people to prayer. Pray to the Holy Trinity. Ask for the intercession of Holy Mary. Ask for Christ for Mary to bring you closer to her Son Christ. And I find nothing particularly terrible about them. But I ask you, are they perhaps problematic because they do have these elements of there being time in the afterlife and what have you? What are your thoughts on that? Because I know the audience are thinking that.
Yeah, personally, I do think they're problematic. But I don't see them as inherently, evil. What I would say is, on one hand, it reflects a desire to pray for the dead, and it encourages people to pray, and that's always a good thing, right? But the problem with these things is when they try and make formulas and bring in literal years and literal time. Even if that's not the intention, people will read it like that.
Yeah,
and I think that does some harm. I think it does harm. Number one, from ecumenical perspective. I mean, that's the kind of thing that does drive a further wedge between us and our separated brethren, both Protestant and Orthodox.
Yeah.
But at the same time, too, there's a tendency for people to fall into the idea of Catholicism being magic. By magic, I mean supernatural powers that we can control. If you do certain things, you get certain results. If you say these words, you get a result that you expect, almost like, Harry Potter, you cast the words of the spell. If you do it correctly, if you follow the formula, you get the result. That can happen in Catholicism and how people view things. A pet peeve of mine, this is a popular thing these days, is people who want to sell a house. They get a statue of St. Joseph and they bury it upside down, and that magically sells the house, right?
Yeah.
And that's magic. That's not Catholicism. That's magic.
Sure. Yeah.
And these types of prayer cards, I think, inadvertently can give the impression that Catholicism is a kind of magic. We do this thing, we get this result. Really, Catholicism, like all forms of Christianity, is about surrendering our will to the will of God. We can't make God do anything. We can't control God. No action we take can force his hand. But again, I think those little prayer cards and that kind of thing can create that impression. A little story to illustrate the problem with this. So years ago, somebody I know, she was Catholic, but she kind of had some issues with the church. She was trying to work through some things. She went on a trip to Italy, and I forget where she was, but she came to this one shrine, and she was very puzzled because there is a staircase at the shrine, and there were all these old ladies on their knees going up and down the staircase. And apparently the tradition was to go up the staircase on your knees. And all these little old Italian ladies, like 80 years old, like machines, just going up and down the staircase, up and down, up and down, up and down, and like repeatedly. And my friend was like, I got to see what this is about. So she got down on her knees and she went up the staircase. And for her, as somebody not used to going up the steps, especially like stone steps on their knees, this was a very slow, painful process. And she's working her way up, and meanwhile the old ladies are passing her, right? Like she's, the car going 20 miles an hour on the highway. She finally gets to the top, and there's a sign saying that if you go up the staircase on your knees, you get like 500 years off of purgatory. So you have all these old ladies there who are just going up and down, like pros. And are they doing this every day? She was under the impression these people do this almost professionally. They're preparing for the afterlife by going up and down the staircase, racking up all these years off of purgatory.
Yeah.
That is troubling. I'll be honest with you. That is troubling. Those old ladies, God bless them. The Lord knows their hearts. He knows that they have good intentions, but they'd be much better off devoting that time maybe to helping the poor, to praying for others, to doing works of mercy. as opposed to spending day and night going up and down a staircase on their knees. That being said, it's probably great cardio and keeping them alive, with healthier hearts.
Right.
Who needs Stairmaster when you have a staircase? You can go up and down on your knees all day.
I got to tell you, Father Deacon, that is a really, really good point there, because the Bible does call us to doing acts of mercy, acts of penance. Very, very good point you have there. But when we then begin to toss in superstition into Catholicism, it does become problematic. And I hear it very often, Father Deacon. Look, to be very clear, all of my wife's family are Protestant. So, every now and then I'll hear of the latest superstition that is that a person at church maybe believes and holds to. But we need to emphasize what is Catholic teaching and what is not Catholic teaching. I think you've done a fantastic job of that. But I'm gonna toss a curveball at you, and of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts when it comes to purgatory. I stop and I think of the incredible ancient witnesses talking about post-mortem purification. Think of St. Clement of Alexandria. And then a document that does come to mind, I know you've heard of it, you probably even read it, the Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas, and many others. Now, I wonder, Father Deacon, and I guess perhaps we won't be able to come to a definitive answer tonight, but your thoughts. Is it possible, as the Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas shows, it kind of illustrates purgatory as a location? Is it possible that maybe there is kind of a location for certain individuals as their purification process in the afterlife, and then perhaps there's simply a divine purification suffering in the afterlife? My question is it possible that the purgatorial suffering for certain individuals could be different? So my question would be, perhaps the Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas is not incorrect, and perhaps what St. Basil talks about of purgatory is correct. Perhaps the vision of that is correct, and on and on. Perhaps there are different varying degrees of kinds of post-mortem purifications in the afterlife. What is your thought on that?
I think it's possible.
Right.
I myself favor the Eastern position on this, in part because I'm, Eastern Catholic. But again, I believe that the Eastern position, when understood correctly, in no way contradicts the Catholic teaching. They're very complementary. They're really the same in many ways. But that being said, it is possible that purgatory takes very different forms for different people. We don't understand any of this. Frankly, we're all speculating here. We're talking about things that are beyond human comprehension. Yeah. And for some people, talking about it in terms of being a place might be the only way they can make sense of it. For others, talking about it in terms of being a fire might be how they make sense of it. For others, it might be toll houses. These are all different attempts to wrap our minds around things that human beings can never understand in this life. This is so far beyond our comprehension. So is it possible that for some people, it might be a place or something like a place? Maybe. This is all beyond our understanding. It is. I will say that a lot of the Eastern Fathers, would talk about, again, they would never use the word purgatory, but they talk about this place after death as being almost like a part of Hades, right? Part of the underworld, the place of the dead, Sheol, and that is presented as a place as well. So again, we're all pretty much just pulling on different analogies to explain that which is ultimately beyond our human mind to comprehend.
Now, Father Deacon, that being said, what I tend to do is when dialoguing with individuals, I tend to emphasize that the church has not defined that it's a place. So kind of like you, I tend to move away from that because I find that the majority of people are in their mind, they believe it must be a place. So I tend to move away from that. And I tend to really emphasize, because in my opinion, I believe it could be a state of being. It could be a state one goes through, whether it be instantaneous or what have you. We really don't know. We're merely speculating. But I never really emphasized it, about the possibility of it being a place. But my question to you is, would you do the same? Would you kind of emphasize the opposite? Would you kind of emphasize, I think you just said it, you emphasize the Eastern tradition, Because in my opinion, I agree with you. I think the Eastern tradition, to me, does make the most sense.
Yeah, I personally shy away from ever talking about it as being a place, and I emphasize that we do not teach that it's a place. And I think from an ecumenical perspective, that actually helps break down barriers, because a lot of not just Orthodox Christians, but Protestant Christians are under the mistaken notion that we as Catholics believe in this third place apart from heaven or hell. And we don't. We don't. And I think anything we can do to kind of shoot down that misconception makes it possible to have a real deeper understanding of each other. I think that's helpful. Now, I'll tell you what I do like. There's speculation. Again, this is all speculation, but there's some speculation that I've come across, which I think is a really interesting way of understanding this, that the so-called fire of purgatory is really the presence of God.
Yeah.
And there's a long tradition in both West and East of associating God with light. Christ is the light of the world. We know, of course, the story. Moses goes up Mount Sinai. He's in the cloud. He's in the presence of God. When he comes down, he's just a being of light. Light is shining through him so brightly, he has to cover his face because he's blinding. Jesus at the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor, he shows his true nature, and we see this blinding light coming from him. That light is God, the uncreated light. So the fire of purgatory could really be viewed as that light. And depending on the state of being you're in, when you enter that light, you have a different response to it. So for some people, entering that light is an experience of bliss and joy, an experience of complete peace, because they're ready to be there. For other people, that light might be difficult because there are things they're holding on to, keeping them from totally surrendering to God. And for them, they may have to be in it for a while in a state of discomfort before they become comfortable in it, because they have to let go of some things. And then for other people, it might be torture and torment, because that light is burning away things they never ever want to let go to, things they've set their hearts on for eternity. And for those people, that might seem like hell. So it's possible that the fire of purgatory isn't literal fire, but it's the light of God. It is God. And being in God's presence has different effects on people. For some people, it's heaven. For other people, it's purgatory. For others, it's hell. That's one way of looking at it. And a lot of the Eastern Fathers talk about it that way, without referring to as purgatory, of course, but they talk about it being, the presence of God. And actually, Pope Benedict wrote something about this in one of his encyclicals, I believe, Pope Benedict XVI, in which he talked about that light being Christ's presence. That's the fire. And that's a very Eastern perspective. And to me, that makes more sense than anything. Now, again, that also is just speculation, but I think it's speculation that has a lot of merit to it.
I completely agree. And I particularly enjoy the words of Lactantius, the same divine fire. He begins talking about it as being a divine fire, and he'll then identify it as being the divine fire of God. Really, really good points there, Father Deacon. And as we round off our show, I wonder, do you have a few minutes for a few questions?
Oh, I'd love to. I love answering questions.
Wonderful. So let me look, and what do we have here? This is fun. Okay. From Ryan. Again, Ryan has incredible questions. Father Deacon, this is a good one. I've heard it often. Do you believe some in the intermediate state might fall into hell due to no one praying for them?
Well, the Catholic understanding has always been that anyone in this intermediate state is ultimately going to be in God's presence, because otherwise they'd be in hell. So if somebody, is going through this intermediate state, ultimately they're going to be with God. They cannot fall into hell. Now, that being said, the toll house theory, right? The toll house theory tends to be a bit more negative on that. According to the toll house theory, it's possible for some people to fail these tests, these toll houses, and then lose salvation. But again, the fathers who talk about this, we're doing so figuratively. They're making an analogy. They didn't literally mean this. And even there's debate as to whether or not, failing the toll house means loss of salvation or not. That's not really clear. But the traditional belief, and the one I personally subscribe to, is if you make it to, for lack of a better word, the intermediate state or purgatory, that you ultimately will be in God's presence.
I tend to agree with you, because when we do read about that purgatory in 1 Corinthians 3, the fire, which of course is not literally, you don't have to take it as literal fire, but the man that goes through that fire, that goes through the purification, is saved. So I do agree with you there. Now we have Mick Vine. Is purgatory an extension of theosis in Eastern thought?
I would say the purgatory is the belief in purgatory as understood in the East is very much related to theosis. Again, without using the word purgatory. So in Eastern thought, and again, it can vary from father to father, but the general pattern you see is this. You typically believe that for the soul to be in God's presence, to fully, be with God in heaven, you have to go through 3 not quite distinct stages. The first would be purification, in which you let go of that which is holding you back. And a part of that is, as it says in the scriptures, blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. So to really have an encounter with God, your heart must be pure. You must be purified. That's the only way that you will see God. So you have to go through the stage of purification. And once you go through that, you go through a stage of enlightenment. And during enlightenment, that's really where you come to have an experience of God. And then this leads to theosis. And theosis is us becoming godlike beings, coming to share in God's own divine nature, Now, these 3 things don't necessarily have to happen in that order. There can be overlap. It's not cut and dry, right? It's a little bit messy. But the reality is you have to go through all 3. So the state of purification, you have to go through it now or later, either in this life or after the life. But then once you go through the state of purification, theosis can continue or perhaps begin, depending on how you look at it. But theosis, is the destiny of all human beings who are open to it. We're created for theosis. We're created to become, beings like God, sharing God's own supernatural life. As St. Athanasius said, God became man so man could become God. That is what we were destined for. That's our destiny, but we can choose to reject it. But this continues after death. But again, we're not going to get there unless we're purified, and that purification has to take place either now or in the next life. Interestingly enough, in Eastern thought, theosis continues forever, by the way. Even when you're in God's presence, you're still becoming more and more like God throughout all eternity. It never ends, which is kind of an interesting thought, how there's always room there to grow. When you think about it, since God is eternal and infinite, it makes sense that would be becoming like him for infinity.
Yeah, really, really does. This is a good one here. Are ghosts considered to be souls going through purgatory? Now, let me put my thoughts here, and then I'll get your thoughts, Father Deacon. When I look at the early church fathers, and I haven't done a deep dive yet, I've read a little bit, I don't read a whole lot of positive things about ghosts. I really don't. I've never really encountered the idea that a ghost is a soul undergoing purgatorial purification. But I imagine maybe that came up in the medieval era or later. What are your thoughts on that? Because I've really never really run into that in the church fathers.
Right. You don't see too much of the mention of ghosts in a positive sense in any of the fathers. They tend to be very suspicious of such visions and apparitions. There's a general suspicion of any kind of supernatural apparition. Now, in some of the later Orthodox saints who have read about, they do talk about, again, like with St. Paisios, the souls of the dead appearing to them and asking for prayer. Would those be people going through a state of purification? In the mind of St. Paisios, they definitely were in those cases. But more often than not, the ghosts who are appearing are probably demons trying to mess with you. And that seems to be the general feeling. 9 times out of 10, if you're experiencing what we'd call a ghost, it's probably a demonic entity of some kind. But there may be occasions in which those who are going through a state of purification could appear as ghosts. But in those cases, they tend to almost always give some indication of what they're looking for. And what they're looking for is prayers.
What an incredible reply there, Father Deacon. I tend to agree with you. And I tend to totally realize why the early church fathers would be wary of a kind of spirit appearing to individuals there. Now, let me look. We had let me see, I'm trying to see another question. Marion, Marion wanted to know if we can find if we can find Purgatory in 1 Corinthians 3. I definitely believe you can, Marion. I would argue that 1 Corinthians 3 is very, very strong when it comes to purgatory. In fact, I'd recommend you look at videos that I've done on the topic. But Father Deacon, I don't know if you want to maybe touch upon that. Do you think that 1 Corinthians 3 is pretty powerful when it comes to, maybe the kernel or the starting point on purgatory?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I think it's a good place to look for that in Scripture. It lays out the core of the belief there for sure.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And Marion, I do know Marion is an evangelical sister. I do recommend you check out videos that I have done. Kyle, no, I did not. Please post your question again. Marion, yeah, just a quick word, Marion. I have no idea what translation you are reading from there, but I can tell you right now that that is definitely not an English translation I have ever read anywhere, and it is not a good one at all. The born-again believer will be saved, although his or her works may be zapped. I have no idea what you're reading there, but I can tell you if there is a text that I have read and studied in the Greek and looked at the Greek fathers on, and when they exegete it, I can tell you right now that it looks nothing like 1 Corinthians 3. Okay, let me look. We'll take about two more, and then because you've been incredible here, Father Deacon. You've been great.
Great questions, by the way.
Oh yeah, I'm impressed. What a great audience tonight. We have, by the way, at one point you had 400 tuning in live.
Sweet.
So right now I know it's probably 9 or 10 in some parts of the world. So we have 200 tuning in live. But people are so stingy when it comes to hitting the like button. Hit the like button. More people will be able to watch the show. It'll help with the algorithm. Okay, I am looking. I'm looking to see if I can find what you wrote, Mark. Let's see. Here it is. I think I did find it. We got William. If purgatory were a real fire, would this give Protestants fuel to say Catholics believe in a free get out of hell card?
I guess even then, I don't think anyone necessarily understands hell to be a literal fire either, right? I think hellfire is just another helpful image. But if Catholics really believe that purgatory were this place of fire, where again, the prongs are coming at you, right? The demons are hitting you with prongs. That sounds a lot more like hell than it does like anything else. So one could perhaps use that as ammunition to say the Catholics believe you can get out of hell for free. But again, that's not Catholic belief.
Yeah, no, not at all. Not Catholic belief. We have a brother tuning in from, I don't know from where, but he's tuning in, enjoying the show, and it is 3 a.m. for him. Thank you for tuning in. We love the fact that we have many people tuning in. I'll take one more. Okay, this is a good one. It comes from James. By the way, I don't know if you've been on James' show, and I don't want to try to pronounce his last name. I don't know how to pronounce it, but James does interviews. He's incredible. James, if you have not gotten Father Deacon on your show, I'm going to grab a tomato and throw it at you. You got to bring him on. Father Deacon's incredible. What is the relationship of the Eastern view of purgation in St. Gregory of Nyssa and the Western Latin conception found in St. Robert Bellarmine?
Okay, refresh my memory as to St. Robert's conception. I don't recall it offhand.
I don't either. I'm thinking of Robert Bellarmine. When I think of him, James, I've read the book he's written on purgatory. I've read it very in depth. He seems to be very in line with what Augustine taught, what the other fathers taught. I don't know if James, and hopefully he'll put clarification, are you talking about the fact that there's a little bit of controversy in the writings of Gregory of Nyssa? I don't know. I really don't know. But I've done work when it comes to Gregory of Nyssa on this particular topic. I'm trying to pull it up, so maybe we can look at it before, but I can't find my notes on it. So, but yeah, James, can you clarify what you mean? I really don't know what you're talking about there. Father Deacon, do you have really any idea?
Like I said, I don't recall St. Robert Bellamine's perspective on this, so I really can't compare them. Again, I know with St. Gregory of Nyssa, there was controversy because he was pretty clearly advocating universalism.
Sure.
But again, when he was doing so, it wasn't condemned. It was valid speculation from his perspective. There's controversy about that. But again, I'm not sure about the Western component of the question.
Yeah, hopefully he can clarify, and if not, maybe another time. But with that, we'll go ahead and before we wrap it up, Father Deacon, the floor is yours. Do you want to point the audience anywhere? Webpage
Sure.
you've got, anything you're working on, anything. Right now, the floor is yours. Anything you want to say.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Appreciate that. First of all, thank you again for having me on. I always love talking with you, William. It's always a blast. And I love your audience. Great questions. If people want to see more of my writings, I have a website called East to West, from East to West. To get there, it's EAST, the number 2, west.org. That's East, the number 2, west.org. On there, I have all kinds of articles I've written, and I have an Eastern Catholic FAQ. We have a lot of frequent questions about Eastern Catholicism. And also, I've been working on a web series called Becoming Byzantine. I've been working on that with Father Daniel Dozier, Robert Klesko from EWTN, and also Father Joseph Matlack. And we have a whole series of videos. To find that, just go onto YouTube and type in Becoming Byzantine. We have webinars, we have lessons on there, and basically it's a walk through the Ukrainian Catholic Catechism, Christ Our Pascha, where we explain the fundamentals of Eastern Catholicism from a Byzantine perspective.
Incredible, and I really recommend that. I will try to find a link to that, and hopefully within about an hour, I'll have that link down here. People can go there, they can check it out. Father Deacon, you've been incredible. Usually you've been incredible. What I love about the shows I do with you, I can pour coffee, we sit down and we talk theology. I mean, there's nothing more fun than that. Getting to talk theology with you, you're incredible. Thank you very much for your time, Father Deacon. I look forward to having you back on in the future.
I would love that. It's always a joy, my friend.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.